NUS salt spray, like a slap, stings his face. It's the last sensation etched into his memory as the captive is dragged toward the longship. The youth is only 17, his home the Irish coast, and his world seems to have collapsed in an instant. The strangers, now masters of his fate, speak a foreign, incomprehensible language, and their crude laughter grates on his ears like a dog's bark. His hands are bound with a rough rope, digging into his wrists, and the acrid smoke from his burning village stings his eyes and chokes his throat like a funeral pyre for the only life he'd ever known. Now, he is merely cargo, a possession, and his journey into the heart of a nightmarish new reality has just begun. This was the Viking Age, a period from the late 8th to the mid-11th centuries, often remembered as a time of great discoveries, brave warriors, and revolutionary shipbuilding. We recall heroic sagas, formidable longships, and the tragic raid on Lindisfarne. However, beneath the romanticized veneer of tales and the mythologized images of horned helmets, which, incidentally, Vikings never wore, lies a far darker and more brutal truth. For centuries, the Scandinavian economy was fueled by a massive, well-organized, and incredibly cruel trade in human beings. This was not a random byproduct of predatory raids, but often their primary goal, the most profitable form of plunder. Countless women, from the British Isles to the Slavic East, learned that the Viking Age meant systematic abduction, commodification, and lifelong exploitation. This isn't mere speculation or a quest for sensationalism. It is a reality meticulously reconstructed from Scandinavian legal codes, monastic chronicles written by victims, archaeological findings, and even the dispassionate, chilling testimonies of Arab diplomats who traded with the Vikings. First, it's worth examining the system itself, as it formed the bedrock of everything. Viking raids in popular culture are often depicted as chaotic bursts of violence. However, the historical reality was far more organized, more akin to a predatory commercial enterprise than mere rampage. Raiding parties were investments. A local chieftain or a group of companions, felags, pooled their capital to build or equip a longship, which required significant investment, timber, iron for rivets, sailcloth, tar, and provisions. Investors expected a return, and the most valuable, transportable, and consistently available asset was live human cargo. The ships themselves were a marvel of engineering, perfectly suited for this purpose. The shallow draft of vessels like snekkers or the larger skades allowed them not only to cross the open sea but also to penetrate far up rivers, bypassing coastal defenses and striking deep into unsuspecting territories. A community living 100 miles from the coast could wake up to find longships at their riverside, with escape routes cut off. This technological advantage gave the Vikings the element of surprise, critically important for successful slave raiding. They targeted what historians call soft targets. Monasteries, such as Iona, famously attacked in 806 CE when 68 monks were killed, were valued not only for silver chalices and embroidered vestments, but also for their inhabitants. Literate monks and people from surrounding communities seeking refuge there. The Irish annals of Ulster are filled with entries striking in their simplicity but horrifying in their implications. An entry for 821 CE reports a raid on County Wexford, where Vikings carried off a great many women into captivity. The phrase, "a great many," appears again and again. This was not an anomaly, it was the business model itself. Once captured, a woman's identity was systematically erased. She was no longer a daughter, wife, or sister, but became a thrall, the Old Norse word for slave. The Old Norse language itself reveals the profound dehumanization inherent in this status. In legal texts, thralls were often referred to in the neuter gender, equating them with livestock as part of a farm's inventory. They were fair, a word that meant both cattle and wealth. In the eyes of Scandinavian law and society, a thrall ceased to be a person, becoming an object, property. Her legal rights were simply non-existent. A master could beat or even kill his thrall without any legal repercussions. According to the Icelandic law code Gragas, a thrall's testimony was not accepted in court. They could not own property of significant value, could not enter into legal marriage, and their children were born into the same enslaved status, ensuring the self-perpetuation of the system. The life of a free woman was protected by a complex system of fines and the concept of honor, whereas a thrall's life was protected by nothing. Hopelessness and lack of rights were constant companions for female slaves in the Viking Age, and the prospect of liberation was virtually non-existent. The path to enslavement began with violent abduction from their homes. Captives, chained, were marched long distances to the longship encampments, the Scandinavian warships. There, along with plunder and Viking warriors, they were crammed into the cramped holds of open vessels designed for voyages lasting weeks. Conditions on board were inhumane. Dozens of people packed into a space about 20-25 meters long, exposed to the harsh weather of the North Atlantic, soaked to the bone by icy waves, and suffering from lack of food and water. Diseases ran rampant, and the psychological terror was unbearable. Many did not survive this maritime hell. For those who did survive, the final destination was a horrifying slave market. Vikings established major human trafficking centers, covering an extensive network throughout their sphere of influence. Dublin, or Dyflin as the Scandinavians called it, became one of the largest and most infamous slave markets in Western Europe, where captives from Ireland and Britain were brought. From here, women were sold to Scandinavian settlers in Ireland, sent back to Scandinavia, or transported to the colonized lands of Iceland and the Faroe Islands. The trade network extended far to the east. Large markets existed in Hedeby, on the border of modern-day Germany and Denmark, and in Birka, a trading center on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden. These eastern ports connected the Scandinavian world with the river routes of modern Russia and Ukraine. This was the famous Volga trade route, along which captives from the west and the Slavic lands of the east, Sakaliba, as Arab chroniclers called them, were transported to the Byzantine Empire and the wealthy Abbasid Caliphate. The slave trade reached colossal proportions. The 10th century Persian geographer Ibn Rushd described the activities of the Rus. Scandinavians of the east, they attack the Sakaliba and sail in ships to seize them, take them captive, and carry them to Khazaria and Bulgar and trade them there. A captive woman seized in an English village could be sent to Dublin, sold to a Scandinavian merchant, transported to Birka, sold again, and then embark on a long journey down the Dnieper or Volga rivers to be sold for the last time in the markets of Constantinople or Baghdad, in exchange for Arab silver and silk. Archaeological findings corroborate these accounts. In Scandinavia, especially on the Swedish island of Gotland, numerous Islamic dirhams have been found, testifying to the intense trade between the Scandinavian world and the Caliphate, where the main export commodity was human beings. At the slave markets, women were stripped of their last vestiges of dignity. They were treated like livestock. The 10th century Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who personally observed Rus traders on the Volga, left a chilling description of scenes that took place at the markets. He recounts how traders displayed their female captives for sale and how a trader would have sexual intercourse with a slave woman in full view of everyone, thereby demonstrating his power over her. This was public humiliation, a denial of the woman's humanity. Her body transformed into a commodity. After being sold, a woman's fate depended on the whim of her new owner. Most female slaves faced hard, grueling labor. They performed the dirtiest and most arduous household chores, rising before dawn and going to bed later than anyone else. Their days consisted of a monotonous cycle, grinding grain into flour, carrying water, tending the hearth fire, preparing food, brewing ale, and washing laundry in icy water. An important task was textile production. The making of vadmal, a coarse woolen cloth, was a labor-intensive process involving shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving. This fabric was the foundation of the Scandinavian economy, used for sales, clothing, and even as currency. This entire industry relied on the labor of enslaved women. The Old Norse poem Rigsthula describes archetypal thrall women with wrinkled skin, gnarled knuckles, and thick fingers, a testament to a life dedicated to continuous manual labor. Archaeological evidence from burials confirms the harsh lives of female slaves. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains showed that individuals buried with fewer grave goods often had poorer diets than the nobility buried nearby. Their bones bear traces of nutrient deficiencies and extreme physical exertion, silent testimony to a life full of toil and hardship. Toil and hardship were an integral part of the lives of women captured by Vikings. However, for many of them, exploitation was not limited to physical labor. They also became victims of sexual slavery, a fact often overlooked or ignored in popular accounts of the Viking Age, yet confirmed by historical and archaeological sources. A thrall woman had no legal rights, and her body was the property of her owner, who could use it for any purpose and at any time. This was not considered a crime, but a right of ownership. The sagas, though written centuries later and often idealized, clearly indicate this social norm. They often depict powerful men taking captured women as concubines, known as frill in Old Norse. These were not secret affairs, but recognized, albeit unofficial, domestic arrangements. For example, Laxdæla saga tells of the Irish princess Melkorka, captured during a Viking raid. The princess's tongue was supposedly cut out so she could not speak. The Icelandic chieftain Hoskuld Dalakolsson buys her in Norway and brings her to Iceland as his concubine. Despite her origins in giving birth to Hoskuld's beloved son, Olaf the Peacock, her status remains enslaved. Children born from such unions faced an uncertain future. They were called frill-born, children of concubines, and their legal status was lower than that of legitimate heirs. A father could acknowledge a child born to a thrall and grant them freedom, but was not obligated to do so. He could also refuse, condemning his offspring to slavery. This created complex social relationships within the household, where a free-born wife had to coexist with enslaved women her husband used as concubines. This system of sexual exploitation was so widespread and important for the settlement of new territories that it left a mark on the genetic landscape of the North Atlantic. Modern genetic studies in Iceland, one of the most thoroughly studied Viking Age colonies, have shown that a large proportion of the Y chromosome DNA of male settlers is of Scandinavian origin, about 80%, while a large proportion of the mitochondrial DNA of female settlers, passed from mother to child, is of Gaelic origin from Ireland and Scotland. The latest estimates put this figure at over 62%. These data suggest that the founding of Iceland was carried out by Scandinavian men who brought Gaelic women with them. Given the continuous Viking raids on the British Isles, it is unlikely that most of these women were willing wives. They were the founding mothers of a new nation, but they were brought there in chains. Their DNA, carried by Icelanders to this day, is scientific proof of a massive gender migration based on abduction and sexual slavery. Some captured women faced a different fate. Women of high birth might be considered more valuable for ransom than for labor or concubinage. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other sources recount instances where Viking chieftains held high-ranking women captive to extort money and land from their families or kingdoms. These women became political pawns, their lives and freedom currency in the diplomacy and wars of the era. They experienced terrible uncertainty, held by those who had killed their relatives and burned their homes. There was also a final, horrifying fate that could befall a captured woman, testifying to the brutal intersection of religion, power, and violence in Scandinavian pagan culture. Archaeological and textual sources confirm that human sacrifice was practiced, and thrall women sometimes became the chosen victims. The most vivid and disturbing description comes from the Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan. In 922 CE, while traveling along the Volga, he witnessed the ship burial of a Rus chieftain. He describes how, as part of the funerary rites, a slave woman was to die with her master and serve him in the afterlife. The concept of her voluntary participation is, of course, a fiction. As a thrall, she had no choice. The slave woman's fate was sealed. Ibn Fadlan's detailed account of the funeral ritual is striking. For 10 days, the chosen girl was prepared for her terrible fate. She was dressed in luxurious clothes, plied with intoxicating drinks, and forced to sing, though, as the traveler noted, her songs were full of sorrow. The girl was moved from tent to tent, where noblemen performed ritual sexual acts with her, each time saying, "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." On the 10th day, the deceased chieftain's body was placed on a ship, pulled ashore. The girl was also brought there, given a final sedative drink. Then, an old woman, acting as executioner and known as the Angel of Death, led her onto the vessel and laid her next to her master's body. The Angel of Death placed a rope around her neck, the ends of which were handed to 2 men. While they strangled the victim, the old woman repeatedly stabbed her in the ribs with a dagger. Ibn Fadlan notes that the girl's screams were drowned out by loud banging of shields, a horrifying precaution to prevent other slave women from panicking and attempting to escape a similar fate. Finally, the ship was set ablaze, transforming it into a funeral pyre, sending the chieftain and his victim to the other world. This chilling account is not a figment of imagination. Archaeological findings confirm the existence of such rituals. Burials showing signs of servant sacrifice have been discovered in various parts of the Viking world. In Flakstad, Norway, one grave contained the remains of several individuals, including a decapitated man, indicating their subordinate status to the noblewoman buried there. The famous Oseberg burial contained the remains of 2 women, an older, presumably noble lady, and a younger one whose skeleton showed signs of a hard life and lower social status. Many scholars suggest the younger woman was a thrall, sacrificed to accompany her mistress in the afterlife. These testimonies leave no doubt that for a captured woman, slavery could be not only a lifelong burden, but also the final bloody act of ownership in the hands of a powerful master, a funerary gift for his journey to the other world. The normalization of this brutality in Viking culture is perhaps its most frightening aspect. In Scandinavian society, owning thralls was a symbol of status and wealth. A person's influence was measured not only by land and silver, but also by the number of unfree people under their control. The sagas, great literary works of the era, depict slavery not as a moral evil, but as an ordinary and undeniable fact of life, as one of the pillars of the social and economic structure of society. Paths to freedom existed, but they were few and arduous. The process of freeing a slave was called manumission. An owner could grant a thrall freedom as a reward for long and loyal service or through a will. A runestone from Herning in Denmark testifies that a man named Toki the blacksmith erected it in memory of his former master Thorgus, who granted him freedom and gold. However, these stories are more the exception than the rule. For the vast majority of captured women, enslavement was a lifelong sentence, passed down to their descendants. The gradual disappearance of this system was a long and complex process. The conversion of Scandinavian kingdoms to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries played a role. The Church disapproved of the enslavement of fellow Christians, leading to a shift in focus towards pagan Slavic and Baltic peoples. Over time, Viking Age slavery gradually transformed into the serfdom of medieval feudalism. Nevertheless, for centuries, this system flourished. The Viking Age reveals the harsh truth about how systems of exploitation function. The abduction and enslavement of women were not merely random acts of cruelty, but an economic engine, a tool of social progress, a legalized institution underlying the expansion, colonization, and prosperity of the Viking world. The silver flowing into Scandinavia, the construction of magnificent halls, the sea expeditions to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, all were made possible by the stolen lives and bodies of women. When studying the Viking Age, it is important to see it in its entirety. We must remember not only the great shipbuilders, but also the women whose forced labor created the sails for those ships. Not only the fierce warriors, but also the frightened girls they carried off in their longships. Not only admire the sagas as great works of literature, but also read between the lines to see the everyday brutality they normalized. Delving into the dark pages of the past, it's impossible to overlook the history of how Vikings treated captive women. This is not merely a grim episode, but a profound examination of the dehumanization process, demonstrating the frightening ease with which a society can reduce a human being to the level of a commodity, a tool, an object for exploitation, sale, and destruction. The evidence of these brutal practices is numerous and undeniable. It is preserved in chronicles created by victims, in legal documents drafted by the Vikings themselves, in the genetic code of modern populations, and in remains resting in the earth. Archaeological findings, such as burials with signs of violent death and genetic studies confirming the influx of foreign DNA into Scandinavian populations, paint a picture of systematic enslavement and violence. The romanticized image of the Viking warrior, free and untamed, proves to be merely a fiction erected on a foundation of unfreedom and brutal oppression. The true legacy of that era is etched not only in runic inscriptions, but also in the silent, suffering, and largely forgotten stories of countless women whose lives were taken to serve as building material for